Good morning, all. Welcome. For those of you that don't know, my name is Barry, and I'm the developer and creator of the Winning Mindset program. I was teaching the Warrior Teachers yesterday, and as usual, they're a feisty bunch, so there was much toing and froing within the session. But the session focused on something that I think was particularly apt, and that was to focus on communication and how they can utilize what they know to help other people understand the situation that's going on within society currently. Hold that thought for a minute and just remember that, because what it pertains to is what happened yesterday when the report by Baroness Casey was released into the grooming gangs, the Pakistani rape gangs, and the systematic and horrific abuse of children. In this case, girls, particularly girls. We've known about this for a very long time. The Sikh community has known about this for a very long time because it's been happening to them. And it is not something that our society has dealt with well at all. We seem to have got this completely wrong. And I was thinking, as I read it yesterday, quite distraught by what I was reading, about how a society crumbles to the extent that this is allowed to happen. Now, you know, and I know, and we know from the reports of survivors that this has been going on for decades, for a very long time indeed. And I know people personally who were victims of this kind of behaviour. But what was ignored roundly and has now been exposed by this report was the ethnic, racial, and the one bit they don't want to talk about, religious element involved in it. That somehow a combination of things, like related to that, cultural and religion, allowed men to behave in such an inhumane way. I looked up the definition of inhumane before I started doing this today. And inhumane means to be cruel and without care for another human. The word really doesn't describe it, does it? And in the session yesterday, when we were discussing and talking about what it means to try to have conversations with people around the subject generally of EDI, DEI, equity, diversity, inclusion, gender ideology, critical race theory, everything that comes with it, was the profound difficulty you have in getting people to enter a space where they are rational enough to actually discuss it, when in fact the whole thing smacks of delusion from beginning to end. I got up this morning and there was a post that had been put online by a podcaster who does regular podcasting, spoken with Rupert Lowe, for example, called Basil the Great. And what Basil had done was he'd revealed the 9 Labour officials who had essentially caused problems when it came to solving this particular cultural horror that we are living through. And he's listed them. Now, Labour have been in for 12 months. The Conservatives haven't showered themselves in glory with this either. But then, considering it's been going on decades, neither has anybody else. But what does it mean? How does this happen? How does this happen? How have we allowed it to happen? In the film Spotlight, which is about the Boston Globe's investigative department, it was called Spotlight, and luckily enough yesterday I had a Warrior teacher from Boston. We discussed this. They uncovered the child abuse scandals, one of the first big child abuse scandals, which linked the church to some terrible behaviours and the cover-up that subsequently came. And what was interesting about that was that there's a great scene in it where this lawyer called Mitch Garabedian is talking to one of the reporters, and he says, if it takes a village to raise a child, you better believe it takes a village to abuse one. And I think there's something in that. I do. But what I'm interested in is how it came about and what the motivations were. I got myself in hot water over the last couple of days by saying that the report cannot centre the victims. And I want you to believe that that came from a position of empathy, that I honestly believe if we allow the government, who is going to be overseeing the production of this report, to centre around victims and new laws and censorship and all the stuff that Yvette Cooper announced, that we will never get to the bottom of this. Never. That is my biggest worry, is that what we will see is once again going to be performative. I'm of the opinion, and I'm more than happy to listen to you, that with a few exceptions, there's some stuff that can need tweaking. I've seen what Yvette Cooper's had to say. I've seen what the report says. There is some stuff that needs quick tweaking. But I'm of the opinion that every law we needed, every process we needed to bring the perpetrators of this crime to court, and not just that, to hold to account the officials, the council officials, anybody involved in the care of these children, to bring them to account, every law that we needed was already in existence. It is my opinion, and again, I will welcome your feedback on this, that we need to not get sidelined by the promise of new laws, of punishment, of revenge, if you will, that we must focus very much on, was there a systemic problem? And if so, where did that systemic problem come from? I have a theory about where that systemic problem came from. And if I'm right, then we're going to have to make sure that this inquiry is very far-reaching indeed, or we will never expunge the situation that developed, the ideas around the situation that developed. If we do not expunge those from our society, then it is only a matter of time before this happens again. There is more than one parallel between what has occurred here and what occurred in the church, what was uncovered by Spotlight in Boston, and then subsequently around the world. They have commonalities, and the commonality is the setting up and the reification of a priestly class. And I think that's what we have done here. Now, that's for you to decide whether you think I'm right about that, but I believe that's what has happened. And then I have to think about what was the tool that allowed us to set up these priestly classes. And it is my belief and my suggestion to you, and I'm hoping that you will think about this very carefully, that the tool that allowed this priestly class to rise was equality or equity, diversity and inclusion, was in fact this entire idea of be kind, equity, diversity, inclusivity, everything that comes with it, which is the bastard child of political correctness. For those of you that don't know, political correctness was born in Russia. It was part of the communist mantra. Something could be politically correct, but actually untruthful. Something would be politically correct because the state said it was. Many years ago, when I was working with the civil service, I remember the introduction, for example, of unconscious bias training. This was then proliferated throughout the entirety of the civil service, one of the biggest employers in the country. And then, as we know, into the NHS, one of the biggest employers in the world. And through that, to schools, to the colleges that teach teachers. I'm using this specifically as an example. This was a training program or a learning program designed to make everybody second guess themselves. And when second guessing themselves, when saying to themselves, do I have bias? To assume that there was a bias of some kind, be it homophobia, racial bias, cultural bias, whatever it may be. In other words, what unconscious bias training was designed to do was to put in between your faculties, in between you going, hang on, there's something terribly wrong here, or is that my own bias? Is to insert between your ability to go, this is a massive safeguarding risk. the thought that you might be a racist or a homophobe or whatever it may be. That, in essence, undid the blanket effectiveness of the most important aspect of these terrible situations, which is child safeguarding. The undoing of child safeguarding is the first step on the path to enabling a priestly class, but it's just one. Once you then begin to say that somebody else's culture is equal to, for example, the culture I see in our country, in all respects, that's just part of their culture. They're allowed to do that as part of their culture. Once you introduce the concept of multiculturalism on top of that, this idea that everybody must second guess about whether or not they're racist or whether or not they're homophobic, once you do that, you effectively eliminate the primacy of child safeguarding. Once you eliminate the child safeguarding as the prime factor in thinking about things, you get what's happened. It's that simple. The setting up of the priestly classes, I think, is a direct result of political correctness, of the EDI-DEI mob, of the EDI-DEI ideology, which started in academia and which has proliferated through our society and has made people lose their marbles. It has undermined a very important idea. And that important idea is that we don't think collectively. We do not become a collective. As that idea went through society, you saw groups of people build. And this is, I believe, this is why groups within work, for example, these affinity groups are so dangerous. Then they start to police what you can say. Well, you can't say that. Or if you say that, we'll expunge you from the group. You'll go from the group. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to say it. In other words, what happens is as these ideas proliferate through society, we see the kind of strictures, the kind of behavior from others that would have been present in Nazi Germany or would have been present in communist Russia. You can't say that. People shopping each other, what would happen in workplaces when you didn't follow the chosen narrative. The narrative of collectivism, that there is this right way to be a human. Be kind, right? Every culture matters. All that, the right way to be a human, a flattened idea. This is equity, by the way. A flattened idea of the right way to be a human. And those that look at you and think you're not doing what it is to be the right way to be a human, think you're poorly. And therefore you must be made well. In comes your unconscious bias training, your critical race theory, or everything else that comes with it. It is honestly my belief that this is at the root of why this has been ignored. I'm not saying that was here before this started. It wasn't. Child abuse has already been with us. But I think this particular representation, the phenomenal concept that it's cultural, religious, and bound by a particular ethnicity and by a particular geographical location, tells me that the framework that has been built by political correctness and EDI-DEI is the framework that allowed this to happen, where people abandon their faculties because they've been told this is how you should be by an elite that thinks the rest of us are poorly. That's what I think has happened. And I'll look forward to hearing your opinion on this. In addition to that, I think it's important to understand how that then retains hold on us. How does that work? What happens when that occurs? What happens when that occurs? And that came up yesterday with the warrior teachers, and I was glad to see them grab it and talk about it with such interest and such enthusiasm. So I want to ask the question, when we as people that don't want any part of this bloody nonsense, the warrior teachers or you out there, try to have conversations with people and try to get them to understand where we've gone so terribly wrong, I think it's important that we grasp just exactly what it is that we're asking them to give up. And that when that thinking goes as big as it does, goes as big as it has, when it infects the population, when it infects the best and the worst of us, that actually we're led to an inertia where fear prevents us from doing anything. And I think that might be what has been happening here. So stay with me if I haven't bored you to death already, and take a look at this here. We were talking yesterday about dimensional thinking in learners. What questions are provoked by the internal dialogue within somebody who, let's say me, out in the pub with my mate, says, listen to me, you're thinking about all this, about race and about it is all wrong. You've got it all wrong. This is when you try to talk to somebody about this, what are we asking them to give up? Now, imagine that this particular virus, and we'll use unconscious bias training as an example, has already taken hold, and we've got a mass of people who think in this way where be kind and equity and all cultures are the same, multicultural. Let's assume that's gone across the board, which I think it certainly has. It is worth remembering, before we go through this, that when they emptied the gulags, the guards who had been in the gulags ended up in the same buildings living with the people who they had been guarding. And when the guards realised what had happened, realised that they were not on the right side of history, realised that they'd done terrible things in the name of political correctness, there were mass suicides by these people. Cult think, group think, equity-driven thinking, collectivist-driven thinking kills. Every story of the 20th century tells us this. But when you talk to somebody who is caught in this, or who may know something is wrong but doesn't want to admit it to themselves, or may know something wrong but has not yet got to the point where they feel they can speak about it, and you talk to them and ask them questions and get them to try and see what we see, this is what they think about. This is the questions they ask themselves. Who will be affected? Can I use this knowledge? How do I explain this and maintain stability? Will I lose face? When can I use this knowledge? What happens when I use this knowledge? Where are the trade-offs in my relationships? Will there be pain? What are my future expectations? Can I live with myself? What is the worst that can happen? What is the best outcome? What can I not foresee? Will I lose friends? Will I lose social standing? Will I lose face? What if I'm wrong? What if Barry's right? How will my future look? What we have allowed to happen is profoundly inhumane. But why it's happened and why it still maintains a hold on us, I think, is profoundly human. But I wanted to put that out there as just some food for thought for you, because I think this is where many people are. They're frightened of the mob. They're frightened of the mob, and I can understand why, as will many others. And it doesn't matter what echelon of life you're from, many will understand what this means, to be scared of the mob, that your internal dialogue is desperately trying to hold on to your existing life, which you know, if you speak out, will be shattered. Is it any wonder over 300 MPs voted against an inquiry? Is it any wonder that you can't get your mum to understand, or your brother, or your best friend? Is it any wonder that that friend of 20 years has abandoned you? Because the fear that surrounds this overarching narrative of equality, diversity, and inclusion, this overall narrative of be kind, this overall narrative of multiculturalism, this overall narrative of there's only one way to be, the equity of thought deranges people. Because there is only so long that you can live that state in that state of fear before it makes you ill. But yet those who would have us live this way, those who would have us see racism in every interaction, those who would have us believe that men can be women, those who would have us believe that boundaries don't matter, those who would have us believe that there are priestly classes who come before safeguarding, are those who think that they are right and that you and I are poorly. That's the problem. And I don't think the answer is more laws. I think the answer is to apply the ones we've got. I don't think the answer is that. I don't think the answer is we need more censorship, which is what they're going to come up with, by the way. Because they will do anything now that there's this sunk cost fallacy, they're so far in they can't get out, is going to require them to do or to commit some kind of social suicide by looking at this chart. The answer to this is honesty. The answer to this is that we, with all the technology we've got and all the ability to keep history in front of our eyes now, must recognize this dynamic which has occurred before with the priests. We must recognize this dynamic. We must identify this dynamic, and we must indelibly write it upon the mind of every child growing up and the rest of us, that the dynamic of equity, the dynamic of collective thinking, the dynamic of there is one message and one message only, is a profoundly anti-human idea that exploits the best of us, that cripples the best of us. And we must record that for posterity and pass it down through the generations, because it's the only way that we will ever stop the look the other way phenomenon that happened to this. It does take a village to raise a child. And I think Mitch Garabedian was right. It also takes a village to abuse one. Thank you very much. Let me know what you think. I'll see you later.